If you're recording now, there we go. Okay, good morning everyone, and you're very welcome to this session about sharing volunteers could volunteer passports work. And there's been a real interest in this topic. It's one of those things when we put it out, we weren't sure how it would be received or if there would be much interest in it. So we've been delighted in the number of people who've contacted us about it. And it has come about, it was a report produced to government, Danny Kruger, and he made a number of proposals, and Denise is going to take this particular one and have a wee look at it just to see what we think in terms of Northern Ireland, how, if it was to be implemented, how indeed it might work for us. There's probably too many people to go round the room, round the screen this morning. So just for your own interest, if I read you out some of the organisations that are represented today. We have a CC, we have Action Hearing Loss, we have a council, we have a trust, we have a university, we have guide dogs, we have a Northern Ireland Museum Council, we have Alzheimer's, UHub, Society for St Vincent de Paul, Parkinson's, National Trust, Marie Curie, the Welcome Centre, Action for Children, the Eden Project, Deaf Blind. We have some friends joining us from England, from the DCMS, from the department, Merton Council, and the Royal Geographic Society. So quite a mixture there of organisations, and say some people might join us in a few moments as well. So I'm going to hand over to Denise now, who's going to take us through the presentation for this morning, just to introduce the theme. Then we are going to, hopefully, if we can manage the technology, break into a couple of smaller groups just to allow you to unpack and think about what you've heard. And then we'll come back into the bigger session and hopefully just round everything off and finish up roughly in about just over an hour's time. Okay, so if people are happy enough with that, Denise, I will hand over to you, and Julianne, if you want to share the PowerPoint.
Great, thanks very much, Sandra. Just while we're waiting for Julianne to put up the slides this morning, here we go. Great. So we're going to be focusing on the volunteer passports idea this morning. Oh, are you going to let me have control of this? Can I move these myself? No. Okay, so Julianne, if you want to go on to the next slide for me, please, that would be great. Okay, so just for those of you who don't know us, and as we have a few organisations perhaps from further afield this morning, Volunteer Now is a regional support organisation for volunteering in Northern Ireland. We work to encourage and enhance and enable volunteering wherever it happens. So that's voluntary sector, private sector, public sector, across the piece. And we have also a social enterprise called Volunteer Now Enterprises, which supports our work and delivers training and quality standards, consultation research. So that's just a wee bit about us. If you want to go on to the next slide, Julianne, that would be great. Okay, so as Sandra says, I'm going to just give you a wee bit about local policy and the links to the Kruger report, and just say a little bit about what the content of the Kruger report is. And then I'm going to spend a little bit of time just explaining what I see as the passport proposals and throwing out what I imagine are probably all in all of your heads as some of the issues and challenges that potentially might come, but also some of the benefits and the opportunities. So I think we want to have a really good sharing discussion this morning and thrash out what we think are the potential opportunities and the barriers, because I think this could help to inform our own local policy over the months ahead. And as Sandra said, we'll have a group discussion in small groups and then feedback in a plenary and finish hopefully by just around 12. Julianne, if you want to go on to the next slide, please. So just to set the context in terms of Northern Ireland volunteering policy, those of you who've been around in volunteering for some time will know that we have had a volunteering strategy in Northern Ireland. It was published in 2012 and technically expired in 2017. However, in the absence of anything else, which we have been in the absence of for the last number of years, I know that certainly the Department for Communities is still funding Volunteer Now in the sort of objectives of the old strategy. There was some work that was done over the last couple of years in terms of being able to think about the new strategy and plan for a new strategy, but because of the lack of ministers, that was never signed off. And then now that the pandemic has hit, I think there is a view within the department that there needs to be a fresh look at all of this. So earlier in the year, around sort of June time, the Department for Communities commissioned Stephanie Morrow, who is a consultant with the Strategic Investment Board, to do some work just reviewing how volunteering had happened during the pandemic, what the challenges had been, what were the issues around supply and demand, how had things worked, and then also to take a look at policy across the UK and in the Republic of Ireland, and also to see if there were any kind of learning and good practice ideas from elsewhere and further afield. So Stephanie has drafted a report, and the report sets out some of the challenges that we've all lived through over the last 6 months, and then a series of themes which might need to be considered in any future volunteering policy. As at the moment, that report is just an internal working document within the department. They're looking at it, and I think then we anticipate that there will be work towards a future volunteering strategy. I imagine that it won't start much before the new year, even in terms of thinking about that. But I think that there will be an opportunity to engage with that as time goes on. My feeling about it as well is that it may not end up being a volunteering strategy on its own this time round. It may be a pillar in a wider strategy about renewal for the sector post-pandemic, but that still remains to be seen. So I think some of this is still up in the air, but it's interesting to see how ideas and thoughts coming from elsewhere, like the Kruger report, are even beginning to permeate and influence the thinking in terms of that report. So it is important, even though Kruger was, I think, ostensibly written for England, I think it's still valuable to explore some of the themes. And that's why we've set out a number of these little vote sessions over the next few weeks, just to start to pick up on some of those themes and think a wee bit about some of them and see how they maybe have a fit, if not, or not, for Northern Ireland. So if you want to just pop onto the next slide, Julianne. Okay, so obviously in the springtime, we all heard the huge narrative about how volunteering had supported people through the pandemic, you know, the massive upsurge in neighbourliness and connection. And based on that, there was a call for, you know, how do we sustain this? I mean, I also think that there was another narrative going on, which was not so much in the popular culture at that time, which was about organisations who had largely closed, who weren't able to involve volunteers, who in many cases had been active volunteers for decades. And so I think there were 2 or 3 things, maybe more, going on at that time as well. But in the public zeitgeist, the narrative of an upsurge of volunteering was very much to the fore. So the Prime Minister asked for a report on this issue, and he asked Danny Kruger, who's an MP, a Conservative MP, who has experience of working in the third sector in the UK, to develop a report. And that was requested in July, and the report was produced in October. And he did consult with civil society organisations, local authorities, parliamentary colleagues, and faith groups, community groups, social enterprises, really to try and kind of map a bit what had happened, to describe and provide a narrative for what had happened, but then also to set out some thinking about how to sustain things and how to continue to move things on. And you'll see the kinds of things that are in his report. I have put the link there on the slide this morning, and we'll send these slides around afterwards. But the kind of things that you're seeing there is that the idea of a new social covenant, and that's really about the relationship between government and the citizen, and, you know, the idea that people will step up to support and help their communities, and that feeling of local decision making, local community response, local buy-in, strengths-based approaches, and also the importance of social infrastructure. I mean, we have seen substantive cuts in Northern Ireland over the last number of years, and that has impacted on infrastructure, you know, local community associations, local community provision where people can meet. But I do think in England the context is very different in many ways, with lots of libraries having closed, community centres, a lot of youth work was cut, and I think there has been definitely a dearth of those opportunities for people to meet together, and that has had an impact. So you can see that played out in the report. And he makes 3 sets of recommendations under the themes of power, people and places. The power ones are very much about digital, and you can see digital playing out as well in the people recommendations, but there's also stuff about how government commissions work, also about how communities have opportunities to exert power on local decision makings, very much focused on that place-based policy. Again, as I say, more social infrastructure and more philanthropy and social investment. But I'm going to focus this morning on the people recommendations, and in particular the volunteer passport, but you'll also see in the people recommendations things around service opportunities for young people, a new deal for faith communities, and this business of recognition through the honours system is also to the fore. I suppose it's you know, it's interesting that some of the policy imperatives in this document have been something that we have thought about in Northern Ireland. Certainly over the last number of years, you've seen that kind of co-design, co-production idea very much in sort of public policy, particularly within the Department of Health in some ways. But whether or not that's actually, you know, really making a difference, I think is still very early days, and it's not clear that that would be the case yet. I suppose the other thing to say is this report does refer to UK in many places. However, I do think it probably is England. I know it's been received in different ways in other parts of the UK. I know Wales are currently undertaking their own volunteer policy review, and Scotland are in the same position. So they're kind of looking at it, thinking it's interesting, but it won't necessarily shape volunteering policy in all 4 parts of the UK, because volunteering, as you know, is a devolved matter. And so each government in its local jurisdiction will take its own decisions. However, that said, Joanne, if you go on to the next slide, the volunteering passport idea, I mean, I don't know, I've been in volunteering, working in volunteering for 20 years this next March, and I think Sandra maybe has pepped me at the post there and is much, much longer than that. If you've been around a long time, volunteering passports come and go, and people talk about them, and you know, it's something that you hear. And I suppose, you know, part of me thought when I saw this again, I thought, oh, here we go again. But I also think that it is a valid thing to explore. And I also think with the coming of more digitalization, that there is a flexibility and a possibility to do something perhaps different from maybe when the last time this kind of idea was discussed. So I suppose in the document, the Kruger report, you can see the idea that the volunteering passport belongs to the individual, and it's that person's way of kind of moving from organisation to organisation. And the proposals in the document are very much about being able to have that flexibility to move through the organisations in the voluntary and community sector, but also into the statutory sector and providing public service as a volunteer. It's very much looking at supply and demand. I mean, clearly in the springtime, we had many, many more people step forward to volunteer than there were opportunities available. And what certainly we found was that the route to opportunities was not always easy, because sometimes organisations were just too busy and overwhelmed by the services that they were delivering at that stage to be able to actually onboard new volunteers, when actually maybe they could have done with them, but they just didn't have the capacity to deal with them. And the idea of this passport, I suppose, idea is that as an organisation, you can allow yourself to surge when you need it. So take on new people very, very quickly at a point where you really need it. So it's very clearly rooted in some of that emergency response, but it can also be something that can work very well in peacetime, for want of a better term. It does allow people to have one single entry point into the system. So that person would do one identity check, one recruitment process. And I imagine as well, and I suppose this is me imagining it, but I think there would be one set of generic training at the start. And then organisations would provide role-specific training when the volunteer came into their world. So it would provide a lot more flexibility, I suppose, from an individual point of view, because you would be able to dip in and dip out of opportunities much more readily, without having to go through a whole process of recruitment again. And that idea is very appealing, because if you see the thinking time research, for example, that was published by NCVO last year, very clearly people are saying that bureaucracy is a big negative in terms of volunteering, and people want to have that flexibility and that opportunity to readily engage with volunteering, rather than feeling they have to jump through loads and loads of hoops. And I know that's something that many of you have pondered on and thought on over the years as well. If you want to move on to the next slide then, Julianne. So building on that, clearly it is about reducing bureaucracy. In the report, you will see as well that it's focused on as well enabling people to record their skills, build their skills, kind of almost create that little volunteering record of their journey. And then that might be of use, particularly I suppose for some groups more than others, might be useful in terms of thinking about applications for jobs or college or different things, or even just as a person developing your own self. So there is an advantage from a volunteer's point of view, because all of that would be maintained in one place, rather than at the moment, if you're volunteering with 4 or 5 different organisations, that record is a bit disparate and it's harder to kind of draw that all together. It's very clearly in the document proposed that it would be an IT-driven passport approach. The suggestion is that it would be non-proprietary and not commercial, so it would be done in the public service approach. It would be co-designed with volunteers and volunteer-involving organisations. It's very clearly thought of as being something that's very flexible. I mean, there is a criticism that a lot of some of the older volunteer management software can be clunky enough at times and doesn't always deliver just what you want it to. I think we've all seen that. We've all worked with those systems. It's not always exactly what you want. So the idea in this passport that's been set out in this document is it would be very state-of-the-art, very flexible, and as I say, IT-driven. There would be safeguards built in there in relation to ID checks and all of those kind of things, but also in terms of the kinds of roles that would be available. It's not seen as a job substitution avenue. It's not seen as something that would be designed to allow, say, for example, public sector roles to substitute for paid jobs. I mean, that's very clear in the narrative around it. It is very much designed to think about those kind of surge times when you need a lot more people very quickly, but it's also designed to think about those kind of ongoing community support roles, the possibility as well of public service, and also trusteeship is mentioned, because clearly we all know that it can be difficult to find trustees, and so that can be a challenge for organisations. It refers to this idea of driving more and better volunteering, although interestingly, I don't think it really expands on that particularly well. But I suppose in thinking about it myself, you could see how this context would allow competition for volunteers in that pool, and so the more appealing your role, the better structured, the better supported. You could imagine that would be something that'd be more attractive to volunteers in this space. But also there's an argument as well, if you as a volunteer coordinator are spending less time on bureaucracy, then you have more time to make sure that the roles are well developed and well supported, and probably more appealing to the people who might be thinking about them. So there is definitely space for new innovation and development if this kind of system came in. As I was trying to think, where have I seen this working? And I suppose the closest example that I can think of in Northern Ireland to this is our Volunteer Now's events team. So we came to events about in 2012 initially, and then definitely in 2013 for World Police and Fire Games. And since then we've done quite a substantial number of big events and small events actually. We have a team of about 1,000 volunteers who are our volunteers. We recruit them, we put them through the recruitment process that's agreed. Now the role within the events team is not access NI checked. So that is something that we need to sort of say about that events team. However, it does mean that there's about 1,000 people in that, and those people do dip in and out. They volunteered. We've run events with Belfast City Council through the Tall Ships. We've done golf. We've done Lap the Lock. We've done Culture Night. And we've done lots of other smaller events as well as some big ones like Gran Fondo and Giro d'Italia as well. So those people who volunteer in that team, some of them do one event a year, some of them do every event we do, some of them pick and choose and only do our golf events, some only do the cycling events. It just depends on the person. But that person in that team is not going through a recruitment process just because they're going to volunteer with the British Open, for example, instead of, so it has really, I suppose, a slimmed down bureaucracy from that point of view. And we manage that completely through the Better Impact system. So it's all IT driven. So it's very similar in that sense that there's one, I suppose, set of information that's retained. However, then I suppose, it isn't an option. I think it's more problematic possibly in that space for Access NI currently, because I don't think you could manage that within that. But I suppose I was trying to think of a lived example of something like this, and certainly our events team would be a lived example. It's not a cost-free option. It isn't something that you do need resources to make it work, because there still needs to be something standing behind this kind of passport idea that does the sort of basic recruitment and the checking and all the rest of it, and also keeps up with the communications with volunteers, because that is actually one of the really big parts of the work of that team. So that just gives you a bit of a flavour of the kind of proposals and the kind of thoughts that are in the Kruger report, and just a wee bit of thought about how we've potentially made something like that or something similar to that work for us over the last 3 or 4 years in Northern Ireland. So Julianne, if you want to go on to the next slide, I think it would be useful now to split into smaller groups and have a wee discussion about the passport idea, and have a wee think about it both from an organisational perspective and also from the volunteers' perspective, and think about what are the sort of advantages, the things that you could see that would really help it to work well, and also things that you think might be challenges and difficulties, or things that would need to be given some thought to kind of see how it would be actually managed. I suppose I was thinking when I was preparing for this, in a way, what problems, it's useful to think about this in the discussion, what problem are we trying to solve through this idea of a passport, and is this the best way of doing it, or are there better solutions out there that we could think of ourselves? So that would kind of frame our discussion hopefully this morning, and that hopefully gives you enough information and meat to start with in order to really drill down and think about some of these ideas. So I think magically now Julianne is going to split us into 2 discussion groups. We'll have 20 minutes in our groups, and those of you who are familiar with Zoom will know that it's pretty brutal. At the end of that 20 minutes, you'll just be back into the main group, whether you like it or not. That's it. It's over. And then at the end of that, it would be great if one of you could feed back from each group, if we could have a bit of discussion in the plenary at the end. So without further ado, then I'm going to see if Julianne can split us, as it were.
Do you think we'll ever get used to this? Sitting staring at screens. It's crazy, isn't it?
I kind of hope we don't. And that way we'll all want to go back into one-to-one meetings in real life, which is what I'm dying for. Actually,
I know.
Yeah, I've just come from running our first online induction training session after George's
Excellent.
training, and it was just utter chaos. It was wild. Everything technical that could go wrong went wrong.
You see, that's what happens, isn't it? Indeed.
And then it sort of throws you.
Okay, I think that's everybody back now, Denise.
Yes, I think it looks like it, Sandra. So do you want to take us through this discussion bit, or do you want me to do it?
Well, I was volunteered, I think, or actually, no, I was left. There was nobody else volunteered, so I'm going to do the feedback for my group. So I will, I'll do that as quickly as I can. Basically, I would say overall, my group wasn't particularly enamoured by the idea. Certainly, we would be saying that no matter what, something like that would need to be tested by the sector, in the sector, and to see does it actually work. In terms of some people did see that there are certain advantages around maybe for younger volunteers in terms of giving them a breadth of experience. They could see the nature of it being attractive to young people, and even for international volunteers, you know, working in that sort of context. And the whole idea that episodic type of volunteering suits, you know, some maybe younger people or whatever, and that could be worked. It could work for some people. We would like, if it was, that it would be recognised by, you know, organisations, businesses, etc., so as it actually came with a bit of oomph as such. Could see advantages in terms of that whole idea of the surge and emerging responses that the organisations can deal with that through that. But we also felt that, in actual fact, you know, there are organisations in Northern Ireland who are already dealing with things like that and have systems in place to do that. But there could be an opportunity for that sort of bank of volunteers to help with emergency responses. A point was made, and I think it's a good one too. You know, we are all, and I think over the last few months, we have been looking at how we can reduce bureaucracy and maybe put things more online, and that in itself is okay. It's a good thing, but there has to be an individual response, and organisations, you know, it's a great idea in theory, but in actual fact, it is, you know, organisations, a lot of them, most of them around this screen actually, are very specialised in what they do, and the point was made that they will still want to interview the people. They, you know, still have, by nature of the people that they work with, they have rigorous recruitment procedures which need to be gone through, safeguarding, and I was hoping I would have got through the whole group without the mention of the two words, but of course it came up, Access NI, you know, which is not portable, and like there is legislation which makes it the way it is. It is about the role being, you know, its eligibility is attached to the role, so therefore, you know, there are big complications there in terms of that. IT infrastructure, people welcome in one respect the whole idea of IT, but also can see that that sort of, you know, if the passport's completely on an IT infrastructure, then it can exclude a lot of people as well. Talked a lot about motivation in terms of, you know, people volunteer for certain reasons, they volunteer for certain charities because they have an interest and they want to help those certain organisations. So we felt we would not want anything that would do away with that. We didn't want there to be a false impression of flexibility. Felt there would probably be a lot of education needed in terms of volunteers understanding that can't read my own notes now. It should be, they can't just go anywhere. You know, you go into the passport, you just can't go anywhere. That it's just not a free for all. There has to be the safeguards in place around that. We also talked about the need for standards. You know, it's just not a willy-nilly thing. There will be standards in terms of what will recruitment look like. Felt it's modelled very much on that whole idea of quick responses, and we're not sure that that fits with the bigger, the general sector as such. And also then, where does the cost burden lie? Who is going to pick up the cost for this? You know, and this whole idea, you get somebody trained in it and then they move on. An interesting point, last point I'll make is, interesting point was, you know, these people coming to you, will you be allowed to go back to the organisation that they maybe were there before and find out, well, actually, were you happy with them? The two words red flags were used, you know, in terms of, you know, can you check out if you feel that maybe there's something just not that you're happy with. It's not, we talked about having the right volunteer for the role and how important that is.
Yeah, actually, I will not go through the same issues because we raised many of the same issues in our group. I think I think the discussion around what is the problem we were trying to solve was an interesting one, and there was a sense that the issue actually was a lack of understanding of volunteer management and a lack of capacity in the sector, and obviously there was that whole surge in the springtime, and partly people couldn't cope with it because there just weren't enough people who were skilled volunteer managers to actually be able to make the best of those people putting themselves forward. So the feeling was, if the problem was that there was a lack of volunteer management infrastructure within organisations, was the passport the right fit, or were you using the wrong tool to solve a different kind of problem? Access and I was thoroughly discussed in our group as well. Sandra, you'll be pleased to know. The issue, I think, also that came through in our discussion is this business of liability and responsibility. So who owns the volunteer, for want of a better term, and who's actually liable if something goes wrong, and where does that liability lie and how is that managed, is something that needs to be teased out if this was going ahead. But there was a feeling as well, I think Bo shared an example from Merton, which was very interesting, where they're developing a kind of almost like standard suite of training that all organisations or groups of organisations can sign up to, which would be around things like safeguarding health and safety, equality and diversity, and roles and responsibilities and boundaries. And that would be something that that all, a number of organisations could say, well, we are going to use this training as an entry point for our volunteering. There was also a discussion about the need for perhaps this might work as a passporting thing for a safeguarding trainer. So if an organisation doesn't have the capacity internally, they could maybe have a standardised list of people who were able to deliver that safeguarding training. And I think overall there was a feeling that it might work for some roles and it might work for some volunteers, but it wasn't a one size fits all for everybody. So I think that gives a bit of an overview of our group. But I'd be really hoping that we'll open the floor for a few minutes now, just before we finish, to see if anybody else has any other thoughts or ideas or things. And actually the question I would have, do we have a better idea? I mean, if we think that passports is not wonderful, what would be better? What would actually solve some of these problems that we're aware of around bureaucracy, around cost of onboarding volunteers for small organisations, those kinds of issues? What would work better? Okay, thank you for coming, Bo. Appreciate your input. Bye.
Oh, hello. Sorry with that. Sorry, but something happened technically when we went into the groups. I was there 1 second and then it went, but somebody came in there and had me get set back on again. So apologies that I would offer why. I'm Martina Munaware and I'm the volunteer manager for the Belfast Health and Social Care Trust. So I'm sorry I didn't get part of that in terms of the discussion, but maybe just is it okay just to say for people's information with it there, Sandra? Yep, yes, okay, thank you. Just to say in terms of that we have carried on as the Belfast Trust in terms of our volunteering. Obviously from March there was a pause on our active volunteers. We have a large number across the hospitals and the community, but quite a substantial part of that, about a third, were shielding or in terms of underlying health conditions. So we had to pause with that, but it was set up, and particularly with Volunteer Now, some with the new COVID roles. But since in terms of then, I think the last number of months, about 2-3 months now, we've had a return of volunteers, and you might have seen them at the Royal in terms of our meet and greet, and but not in the other hospitals. And Macmillan volunteers as well have come back to the centres, and we had a COVID-19 particular role with the Macmillan too. So we have been doing with the return of volunteers. So if you do see them, that's what happened with it. And we have some too in the wellbeing centres in the community as well. But there's still a lot for us that we can't open, particularly at the Mater, and where I would be over at the city as well too. So we see that we've tried to carry on with that. This year has been useful because we want to look towards the future. But there is still a lot in terms of pause for us. And obviously we're inundated in terms of the hundreds of in terms of people looking for at the COVID NHS appeal. So we had a large response to that, and we've got back to everybody and to see who's there. So that's still a long list. So we are more than enough with volunteers at the moment. So if that just brings people up, I'm sorry, just with the technical problems. Yeah, it's good to see everybody.
It's lovely to see you too. It's lovely to see you. No, so I was just, I mean, we literally just will finish now in another minute or two. It was just in case anybody else wanted to say anything about the idea of volunteer passports that we haven't already shared. Go on ahead.
Denise, I was just thinking, somebody had mentioned, I think it was maybe David. Sorry, I'm Kathy from RNID. I manage about 130 volunteers. This would work well for casual volunteers, and that's the area where I see it would be best. Because I was speaking a wee bit earlier about how, you know, specialised a lot of our roles are, like hearing aid support volunteer and that kind of thing. So I really think if we're doing like a fundraising event or a street collection, we're always looking for different volunteers in specific geographical areas. So if we had a pool of volunteers with a passport in that area, and there's very little sort of training involved for that kind of thing, just a very short induction. So that's where I could see it probably working best.
Yeah, no, I think that's very helpful. Anybody else wanted? I thought I saw Joy. Were you trying to come in there, Joy? Were you, or you're on mute?
I was just thinking, sorry, I'm Joy, I'm from Marie Curie Helper Service. I have about 130 volunteers as well, and we're all through the whole of Northern Ireland. I know when we hit COVID, we had a great interest, a great surge of people, and we needed a lot of drivers in various areas. So for PPE, so I was in charge of taking on, well, actually I have 190 volunteers because I've 60 that are doing PPE at the minute. But what would have been great was if we had had a pool of people that we could call on in those emergency situations. Yes, I could see for the shorter things where you're doing events, fundraising, or packing of envelopes or things like that, where people maybe would have those skills and the availability then to do things like that. I think that would really work. Again, I agree with the lady before me, I didn't quite catch her first name. But I would agree that it's more difficult when you're going into, we would be with vulnerable people. Volunteers are going to have to deal with loss and grief and bereavement in our service. So again, that would be a very different, has to be a particular type of person. And I'm sure it's the same for lots of other organisations as well. Our own volunteers have gone down to phone only. So that has been a different thing for them as well. Yeah, I think for events, drivers, fundraising, you know, maybe some of that admin-y type role where you've got just need a surge of people to just come in and help you out. I think it could work, but I'm not sure on the more specifics.
I think that kind of sums it up, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think it does. I think it does. Sandra, I'll hand back over to you to wrap up then.
Okay, well, thanks everybody for your input. Sorry we ran over a few minutes. Just to say the next session is about another issue or proposal in the Kruger report, which is about service opportunities for young people. Are they the answer to recovery and renewal? And that is next Wednesday, same time. And again, you can book through the website for that. So once again, if there's anything that Volunteer Now can do to help, please do get in touch with us. And in the meantime, enjoy the rest of your day. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. Thanks, Denise. Nice to meet you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Lovely to see you all.
Thanks, Sandra. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.